Some seconds last forever, changing the course of a life in the blink of an eye. We capture those eternal moments and turn them into cinematic art that speaks to the timeless nature of the soul. Subscribe today and explore the infinite with us.
She was sitting on my front porch when I pulled into the driveway. My daughter, 34 years old, still the most stubborn woman I've ever known, except maybe her mother, God rest her soul. She had 2 suitcases beside her, a sleeping bag rolled under her arm, and my 7-year-old grandson Oliver pressed against her side like he was trying to disappear into her jacket. It was a Tuesday morning. She was supposed to be at work. I put the car in park and just sat there for a moment, watching through the windshield. Oliver looked up and saw me. He didn't wave. He just watched me with those serious brown eyes of his, the ones that always reminded me of his grandfather's. I got out of the car slowly, the way a man my age has to, and I walked up the path without saying anything yet. "Dad," my daughter said. "I can see that," I said. "Let me get the door." I didn't ask questions right away. I carried one of the suitcases inside. Oliver carried his own backpack without being asked, which told me everything, that somebody had already told him this was serious, that he needed to be good, that now was not the time to be 7 years old. We went inside. I put on coffee. I made him a plate of the crackers and peanut butter I kept in the cabinet, specifically because he liked them, and I set him up at the kitchen table with the old tablet I charged for his last visit. Then I sat down across from my daughter, and I looked at her, and I waited. She'd been crying. Not recently. Her eyes were dry now, that hollowed-out dry that comes after you've already used everything up. She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug I slid toward her and stared at the surface of it for a long time. "He told me to leave," she finally said. I didn't say anything. His mother was there. She paused. She's the one who actually said it. He just stood there and let her. I had never liked my son-in-law's mother. I want to be honest about that up front, because what comes later might sound like I was looking for reasons. I wasn't. I had tried genuinely for 6 years. I had driven 4 hours to their Thanksgiving. I had sat at their table and eaten food I didn't recognize, and smiled at stories I wasn't part of, and never once said a word about the way she looked at my daughter. That particular look, patient and cold, like she was waiting for something to expire. I had never said a word about it, not to my daughter, not to anyone. "What did she say?" I asked. My daughter looked up at me. She said her family had nothing to offer theirs. She said I came from nothing. That Oliver. She stopped. Swallowed. She said Oliver was the only thing worth keeping from the marriage, and that he'd be better raised in their house than mine. I put my coffee cup down very carefully. She said that in front of him? My daughter nodded once. I looked over at Oliver, who had his headphones on now, watching something on the tablet, crackers lined up in a neat row beside his plate, the way he always did. 7 years old, eating crackers in his grandfather's kitchen on a Tuesday morning because his grandmother on the other side had looked at his mother and said she came from nothing. I turned back to my daughter. "How long has this been building?" She laughed. Just a short sound without any humor in it. "Dad." "Since the beginning." She was right. I had known that. I had watched it from a distance, the way you watch weather forming on the horizon when you can't do anything about it yet, when it's still too far away for anyone to take you seriously if you point at it. My son-in-law's family was wealthy, old money, the kind that had been sitting in the same accounts long enough to start believing it was a personality. His father had made it in commercial real estate 30 years ago and had spent every year since then making sure everyone within conversational distance knew it. His mother, Margaret, had grown up with money of her own and had married into more and had apparently decided that this combination made her an authority on human worth. My daughter had grown up in a 3-bedroom house in central Ohio. Her mother worked as a school librarian for 22 years. I ran a small electrical contracting business. Nothing glamorous, but honest work that kept us fed and kept the lights on and put my daughter through 2 years of community college and 2 years at state. She had a degree in accounting. She had married into that family 6 years ago, with stars in her eyes, and I had walked her down the aisle and smiled and shaken my son-in-law's hand, and tried very hard not to think about the way Margaret had looked at the venue my daughter chose, a restored barn outside Columbus. which my daughter had loved for its string lights and its wooden beams, with an expression like she was tolerating a child's drawing being held up for her approval. "Tell me what happened," I said. "From the beginning of this week. Walk me through it." She did. She told me about Sunday dinner at their house, the one Margaret hosted every week, the one my daughter had attended faithfully for 6 years, even when she didn't want to, even when Oliver had a cold, even when she had worked a 60-hour week and could barely keep her eyes open. She told me about Monday morning, when she had gone to her husband with a piece of mail she'd found. A letter from an attorney, something about a property she hadn't known about, a signature she hadn't given. She had asked him about it quietly, privately, the way a wife does when she's hoping there's a reasonable explanation. He had told her she was misunderstanding it. She had told him she had a degree in accounting, and she was not misunderstanding it. By Monday evening, Margaret had arrived at their house uninvited, and by Monday night my daughter was packing suitcases, while her husband stood in the doorway of their bedroom and said nothing, and his mother stood behind him in the hallway and said everything. I sat with all of that for a while. "The letter," I said. "Do you have it?" She reached into her bag and put it on the table. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and put it in my shirt pocket. "Okay," I said. "Dad, you and Oliver are staying here. Your room is the same as it always was. There are clean sheets on the bed." I stood up and took my coffee cup to the sink. "I have some calls to make." She watched me. "What kind of calls?" "The boring kind," I said. "Don't worry about it." Here is what my daughter did not know, and what I had never told her, because it was never the right time and then so much time had passed that it started to feel like information I was keeping for a reason I didn't fully understand yet. 31 years ago, when my wife and I were young and broke and running the electrical business out of our garage, we had gotten a contract. Small job, nothing impressive, rewiring an older office building downtown for a man named Gerald Hutchins, who was just starting out himself and couldn't afford the bigger firms. We did good work. He called us again 6 months later for a bigger job. We did that one too. This continued for several years, Gerald and I building something alongside each other, without ever formally acknowledging that's what we were doing. By the time my wife got sick, Gerald's company had become something significant, and Gerald himself had become what I would call, carefully, a friend. Not the kind of friend you call when you need help moving a couch. The kind of friend who shows up at a funeral and stands next to you and doesn't say anything because he knows there's nothing useful to say. When my wife died, Gerald had offered me a position, not charity. He was too smart for that, and I was too proud for it. A legitimate position, consulting on the electrical infrastructure of the commercial properties his company was developing. I had taken it. I had worked that position quietly for 11 years alongside running my own business. When Gerald's company went public 8 years ago, I had been given a small equity stake as part of a long-term compensation arrangement, the kind of thing that sounds modest on paper and then, if the company does what Gerald's company did, becomes something else entirely over time. I had never mentioned this to my son-in-law's family. There was no reason to. My daughter knew I was comfortable. She didn't know the specific shape of comfortable. I drove a practical car. I lived in the same house I'd bought in 1987. I wore the same kind of clothes I'd always worn. When my daughter had gotten married, I had given her and her husband a reasonable wedding gift and told her I was proud of her and meant every word of it. Margaret had looked at me at that wedding with the specific expression of a woman who has already filed you in the correct drawer and does not expect to be surprised. A retired electrician from Central Ohio, father of the bride. Adequate. I had smiled and shaken her hand. I made my calls that Tuesday afternoon while my daughter slept. She needed it badly. And Oliver watched cartoons in the living room. First I called Gerald, who was in Phoenix but took my call inside of 2 rings the way he always did. I told him the situation in brief. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always respected about him. When I was done, he said, "What do you need?" I told him. He said he'd make some calls of his own. Then I called a man named Paul Delaney, who was an attorney in Columbus and who had been handling my affairs for 12 years. I read him the letter my daughter had found. There was a silence on his end, and then he said, "Send me a photo of that." I did. Another silence. "Where did she sign?" he asked. I told him she hadn't. That was the point. "I'll look into this today," he said. "This may be more than a civil matter." Then I called my daughter's husband. He picked up on the fourth ring, and when he heard my voice, there was a pause that told me he had been expecting something different. I was very calm. I have found over many years that calm is more unsettling than anger in situations like this. Anger is something people know how to respond to. Calm requires them to keep recalibrating. I told him I was aware of the letter. I told him my daughter and grandson were with me and would be staying with me. I told him I had spoken to an attorney. I did not tell him which attorney. I did not tell him anything else. I asked him if he had anything he'd like to say. He said it had all been a misunderstanding. I told him I hoped he was right, and I hung up. What happened over the following 3 weeks was mostly paperwork and phone calls, which is how the real consequences in life tend to arrive. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow accumulation of documentation and disclosed information and processes set in motion that cannot be recalled. Paul Delaney found what he expected to find in the letter, which was that someone had attempted to refinance a property using my daughter's name and had gotten far enough along in the process for an attorney to generate correspondence before the discrepancy in signatures was flagged. This was not a misunderstanding. This was something with a specific legal name that I will not go into here because the details are not the point. Gerald, meanwhile, had made his calls. I want to be clear that I did not ask him to do anything improper. What I asked him to do was make sure that certain people were aware of certain things. Gerald's company had done business with my son-in-law's father's firm on 2 occasions in the past 5 years. There was a third deal in discussion. Gerald simply decided after reflection that this was not the right time to move forward with that discussion. He communicated this through the appropriate channels. No explanation was required or given. My son-in-law called me twice during those 3 weeks. The first call was conciliatory. He had mishandled things, he said. He wanted to work this out. He missed Oliver. I told him he could speak to Paul Delaney. The second call was different in tone, and I let him finish, and then I told him the same thing again. Margaret called once. I had not expected that. She called on a Thursday evening, and I was sitting on the back porch watching the light go out of the sky, the way I like to do. And when I saw her name on my phone, I took a breath and answered. She started with disappointment. The family had tried so hard to welcome my daughter. No one had expected this level of conflict. Surely we could all behave as adults. I let her talk. She moved on to warning. There were lawyers on their side as well. This would not end in my daughter's favor. The property matter was complicated and had explanations that would become clear in due time. I let her talk. Then she moved to what I can only describe as condescension. A reminder, delivered with the particular elegance of someone who has never needed to be direct because they have never had to be, that my family's circumstances were what they were, and that protracted legal conflict was an expensive undertaking, and that perhaps it would be wiser for everyone if my daughter accepted a reasonable settlement and moved on. I let her finish. Then I said, Margaret, I appreciate the call. I'd encourage you to have your attorney speak with Paul Delaney at Delaney & Associates in Columbus. I believe they may already be in touch. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know that firm, she said. That's all right, I said. They'll introduce themselves. I want to tell you about a morning in the 3rd week, because it is the part of this that I think about most. Oliver had started coming outside with me in the mornings. I'm an early riser, always have been, and I'd found him one morning already awake and sitting at the kitchen table in his pajamas when I came downstairs, and I'd made him a small cup of cocoa and taken my coffee, and we'd gone out to the back porch together without discussing it. It became a routine. He was a quiet kid by nature, more of a thinker than a talker, and we'd sit out there in the early light and watch the birds at the feeder my wife had installed 30 years ago, that I had kept filled ever since. And sometimes he'd ask me something, and sometimes he wouldn't. That particular morning he looked over at me and said, Grandpa, are you and Mom going to fix it? I looked at him. Fix what, bud? He thought about it. Everything, he said. I put my hand on top of his head for a moment, the way you do with a kid that age. That particular gesture that doesn't mean anything, except I see you, and you're okay. Yeah, I said. We're going to fix it. Grandma Margaret said. He stopped. It's all right, I said. You can tell me. He looked at his cocoa. She said Mom wasn't smart enough to take care of money. She said it at dinner. I don't think she knew I heard. I didn't say anything for a minute. There was a chickadee on the feeder, the small, efficient kind, doing what chickadees do. I watched it. Your mom has an accounting degree, I said. She's been managing the finances for a company with 40 employees for 4 years. She is one of the smartest people I know, and I know a lot of people. I paused. Grandma Margaret was wrong. Oliver nodded slowly, processing this with the gravity of a 7-year-old who takes information seriously. Then he picked up his cocoa and drank some of it. Okay, he said. We sat there until the sun was all the way up. The resolution, when it came, was not a single moment. It was more like a door closing slowly and then being locked from the inside. The legal matter was resolved in a manner I'll describe only as fully and satisfactorily in my daughter's favor, after it became clear that certain documentation was unavoidable and certain facts were not going to remain private, regardless of anyone's preference. My son-in-law signed what he needed to sign. His father's firm did not recover the business relationship with Gerald's company, and a quiet conversation Gerald had with 2 other colleagues in the same industry had the kind of ripple effect that such conversations tend to have when the people having them are the people Gerald is. Margaret did not call again. My daughter is living 2 miles from me now, in a house she found herself, with a yard that has room for a garden she has been talking about planting, and the garage that Oliver has already claimed for his bicycle, and the elaborate series of ramps he's been constructing out of scrap wood since he was old enough to hold a hammer. She goes to work every morning and comes home every evening, and she calls me on Wednesdays and Sundays without fail, the way she has since she left for college. She does not talk much about those 3 weeks, unless I ask. She is, by every measure I have, okay, more than okay, moving towards something steadier and more fully her own than what she had before. Oliver comes over on Saturday mornings. We sit on the back porch and watch the birds. He has started a list, written in pencil in the small notebook I gave him, of every species he has identified at the feeder. He is up to 11. He is, without question, the best person I know. I was not looking for a fight when I answered the phone that Tuesday. I was not looking for the chance to prove anything, or settle anything, or demonstrate something that had been waiting to be demonstrated. I was just a father. My daughter needed somewhere to go, and I was the somewhere. The rest of it, the calls, the documents, the careful and unhurried process of allowing the truth to become visible to the people who needed to see it, none of that was revenge. I have thought about that word, and I do not think it applies. Revenge is about wanting someone to feel what you felt. That was never the point. The point was simpler than that. The point was a 7-year-old boy eating crackers at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, looking at me with his grandfather's eyes. The point was my daughter sleeping in her childhood bedroom for the first time in 6 years, because she needed a place to land. The point was that when someone tells you that your family has nothing to offer, the only honest answer is to show them, quietly, patiently, in the fullness of time, exactly what they failed to understand. I drove past Bryant Park last week. Not for any reason, I was just passing through that part of the city on my way back from a meeting. There was nobody on the benches. The trees were just starting to turn, that first edge of orange. That means fall is coming whether you're ready or not. I slowed down for a moment and looked, and then I drove home. Oliver was in the backyard when I pulled in. He had added a new ramp to his system, a longer one with a slight curve that he had clearly engineered with some thought. He rode his bike down it while I watched from the gate. He cleared it cleanly, landed well, looped around, and looked at me to see if I'd seen. Good line, I said. He grinned at me. That specific grin, the one that goes all the way up and went around for another run. There is nothing more that I could ask for. There is nothing more that I need. The people who underestimate what you've built, the ones who look at your life and calculate its worth by the wrong numbers, they are not owed an explanation. They are not owed a confrontation. They are only owed to the slow, patient unfolding of what was always true. My family has been here a long time. We are not going anywhere. There is a version of this story where I make noise about it, where I call Margaret back and say everything I thought, where I let my son-in-law know exactly who he had underestimated, where I made sure everyone in their circle understood what had happened and who had made it happen. I thought about that version. I won't pretend I didn't. But I have lived long enough to understand something about the way consequences actually work. They don't arrive because you force them. They arrive because certain things, when left to run their natural course, cannot end any other way. Margaret did not lose what she lost because I was clever, or because I was angry, or because I had resources she hadn't accounted for. She lost what she lost because she had spent years making decisions based on a fundamental error, the belief that she could accurately measure a person's worth from the outside. That error has a cost. It always does. I didn't invent the cost. I simply stopped standing in the way of it. What I want to say to anyone watching this, and I mean this plainly, without dressing it up, is that the most powerful thing a person can build is a life that speaks for itself when you're not in the room. Eleanor didn't need me to defend her. What she needed was a place to stand while the truth caught up. That's what I gave her. The truth did the rest. I think about Oliver at that kitchen table, eating crackers in his neat little row, 7 years old and already learning how to carry something heavy without showing it. That boy is going to be fine. Not because the world will be easy for him. It won't be. It isn't for anyone. But because he's already learning that difficulty is not the same as defeat, that being underestimated is not the same as being wrong, that the people who dismiss you based on what they can see in one glance are almost never seeing the full picture. Intelligence is not always visible. Integrity is not always announced. And the kind of strength that actually holds, the quiet kind, the kind that has been tested by real things, by loss and work and time, does not need an audience to be real. Raymond spent 30 years building something honest. He drove a practical car. He wore ordinary clothes. He showed up. He stayed. And when it mattered, all of that became exactly what it needed to be. The people who came from nothing, as Margaret put it. We know something that people who have always had everything sometimes forget. We know that value is not inherited, and it is not assigned by someone else's opinion of your address or your pedigree or the kind of table you set for Sunday dinner. Value is built. It is built in the early mornings and the long weeks and the handshakes with people who need someone they can trust. It is built slowly and it holds. Eleanor is planting a garden this spring. Oliver has 11 birds on his list. I have coffee on the back porch every morning with the best company I know. That is what this family is worth. It always was.